I'm just going to take a moment to share with you an old story because it flashed in my mind as I took the pillow to come sit here so my feet would touch the floor. This happened many, many years ago here at the ashram when Gurudev decided he was going to retire from doing satsangs, and he had some of us do that. And as you can imagine, it was quite daunting because all you ever heard or saw presented satsang was Sri Gurudev, and now it was going to be the likes of us. So when he asked me to do it, that week I was so nervous about what I would do that I actually dreamt a talk, a logical, sequential talk. I got up, I wrote it down, I still have that. And that was the talk I ultimately delivered. I'd say ultimately because this is what happened. I got up on the stage, I had a cushion under me, and I was a little nervous, and I started to talk, and Gurudev said, "Stop, she looks too small, do something." Think of your self-esteem, your self-confidence. You're shaky to begin with, and that was the first thing. So a couple of fellows rushed the stage with some more cushions. And he looked at me and he said, "Now, begin." So I'm scrambling in my mind. I start speaking again. After a few minutes, "No, stop. She still looks too small. Do something." So they bring more cushions. I start speaking a third time. "She still looks too small. Do something." Now about 10 people rush the stage. They build this mound. They have to give me a lift up to get on top of it. When I sit, if I lean, the whole thing sways from side to side, so the whole thing is unstable. I look ridiculous. I feel ridiculous. And in that moment, a beatific smile comes over his face, and he said, "Okay, now speak." So it was sort of your worst case scenario of what could happen in a public speaking situation. And even though it was very difficult, it gives you courage in future times when you find yourself speaking before an audience. That fond memory just flashed in my mind. Okay, some questions. Gurudev was speaking about how he thinks of religion as undoism. He used to say, "I was born a Hindu, but I became an undo," trying to undo all the damage that was done. And about us, he said, "I'm an undo. Undoism is my religion. The religion of my disciples is Confucianism." So it looks like we've been practicing our religion with you here at the retreat. So first question, what's the best way to deal with the desire to get enlightened? Well, number one, it's better than other desires. Part of the spiritual path is really substitution. In a way, you attach yourself to something good, such as a good desire, to enable you to release that which is not good. When all that is not good is released, the good thing you're clinging to will drop away by itself. So the desire to be enlightened, all things considered, is a good one to retain because it will help you to make good choices in life. The road to freedom is paved with good choices. And at the same time, know that the main thing that obstructs us from enlightenment is desire. Any desire, even a good desire, obstructs that ultimate experience. If you think of the mind like a lake, a desire, any desire, is like a stone falling into the water. What happens when a stone falls into water? Two things happen. First, there's a splash, and then there are ripples. You were fine, then the mind gets depressed because it wants something, and then there's all this activity to get that which you desire. So any desire immediately disturbs the natural peace of your mind, which is what you need in order to be enlightened. Does that make sense? Is everyone following that? The interesting thing is, if you think of desires in general, let's say you're sitting here nice and comfortably and the desire comes. You know, I could really use a piece of chocolate cake. That would really top the day well. So you're sitting here in a very peaceful state, especially after that absolutely blissful kirtan this evening. The desire for chocolate cake comes, the mind's depressed. Then it's working on, how can I get it? When you get the chocolate cake, this is very interesting. All that you manage to do is fulfill the depression that was caused by the desire for chocolate cake. In other words, you go back to your starting point. Everyone following that? But here is the problem with desire, and actually the psychological mechanism behind addiction. You have the feeling that not only did you get back to your original position, but you went like this. The mind, if you graft it, normally is like this. When you get a desire, you put a depression in it. When you fulfill the depression, you just get back to your original straight line. But the mind has the feeling that what's really happening is you're getting a high. Anyone ever think chocolate cake makes me happy? Who has not thought that at one time or another? It isn't that getting the chocolate cake made you happy. Getting the chocolate cake fulfilled the depression created in your mind by desiring the chocolate cake. But as long as we think it makes us happy, we get caught up in this cycle of desire. Desire, the mind gets a depression, all the activity, and then the false illusion that what we get is a source of happiness for us. Even the Buddhist teaching, when the Buddha attained enlightenment, first noble truth, he looked out on the world and he said, oh my goodness, look at all the suffering. I envision that there was probably some disciple there taking notes. First noble truth, the all-pervasiveness of suffering. But I think what really happened is the Lord Buddha looked out and said, oh my goodness, look at all the suffering. And then he asked, what is the cause? Almost like analyzing a disease. You see symptoms, what is the cause? His conclusion, desire, craving, selfishness. Then he asked, like a good doctor, is this curable? And he gave his third noble truth, the cessation of suffering. It can be stopped. And then he asked, how do you do it? Then he gave a protocol, the Eightfold Path. In Raja Yoga, we call it Ashtanga Yoga, the 8 limbs of yoga. Very similar in many ways. So, if you're going to have desires, have good ones. But know that ultimately, even they have to be released for you to be free. You want your freedom to be independent of anything as a support, to find that peace, that joy, or as Gurudev once described to me, that beauty and light that's always within you. Okay? Okay. When I am doing boring, menial, busy work or driving, I enjoy listening to podcasts. Anyone else here? Okay, this person says more often than not, they are pretty dark. Murder mysteries, mobsters, creepy ghost stories, but they are so interesting and entertaining. But I know silence or uplifting entertainment would be better for me and for the world. Must I give them up entirely? You've answered your own question. That's what. We don't only eat through the mouth, we eat through all the senses. And what we take in becomes part of who we are. We are what we eat, physically and mentally, and we eat through all the senses. The Chandogya Upanishad even explains that the food that we eat has 3 levels. The grossest level gets eliminated as waste matter. The middle level builds our body, and the most subtle level of the food that we eat actually builds the mind. So physically, mentally, we are what we eat, and it's not only food that's ingested through the mouth, but through the eyes, the ears, the nose, what we feel. So what we bring in gets projected within us in our own minds. So the choice is up to you. If you're comfortable dwelling in that state some of the time, make your choice. But if you'd like to be filled with light and happiness and goodness at all times, make that choice. Gurudev was speaking about as you think, so you become. There is the Sanskrit saying, Mana eva manushyanam karana bandha mokshayoho, which means as the mind, so the individual. Bondage or liberation are in our hands. We choose what we put into our minds. We pave the way to our freedom, or we pave the way to our continual bondage. And it's our choice. It's our choice. Why don't the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali ever mention God? In other words, what is the ultimate purpose of yoga? The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali do mention God in a number of ways. He speaks of Ishvara Pranidhana as one of the precepts of what is called niyama, the observances that form the ethical foundation of yoga. Ishvara is a name for God. And he says, it's very interesting actually in the sutras, what he says. The whole Yoga Sutras basically is about learning to control the mind. Yoga chitta vritti narodaha, restraining the mind from forming into any modifications so it becomes like a crystal clear lake. And through that lake, you can see to the depths of your being, the pure spirit within you. So most of the book is about practice and non-attachment and all these arduous things one needs to do to attain the goal of yoga. And then, very interestingly, after going through this whole basic exposition, he gives a sutra that begins with the word or. This is Sutra 23 in Book 1. He says, or by devotion to God, you can attain everything. You go, what? The whole book is about controlling the mind. And then in one little sutra, he casts it all aside and he says, or, by the way, through devotion to God, you can be home free. So, given my analytical nature, I pondered that quite a bit. How do the two sync up? And what occurred to me was, what we want is for the mind to be so totally calm, totally still, totally clean, so we can experience our true self. If, number one, you're totally one-pointed toward the divine, you have found a way to control your mind, to restrain it from getting into all sorts of mischief. Number two, if you have total trust in that divine power, no matter what happens in the world, no matter what happens to your loved ones, no matter what happens to you, you receive it with faith and trust. And the instinct to maybe rebel, question, doubt, deny is replaced by not my will, but thy will be done. Not as a theoretical principle, not as simply an act of faith, but as a motion from your innermost heart and being. Things may not look, they may not feel, they may not seem the way they should be, but somehow in a picture beyond my capacity to see, in the wisdom and compassion of that higher power, there's a sense and there's an order, and ultimately it's for the highest good. If one has that type of faith and that type of temperament and capacity, then surrender to God is the shortcut to total enlightenment. But not that easy, not that easy. I'd say especially in today's world, to have that type of faith. And in my thinking, it's incumbent upon each one of us to find a framework, a template, a paradigm, a system of principles and practices that makes sense to us so that we can keep our peace as we move through life. To me, that's what religion is about. That's sort of the ultimate goal in life, maintaining our peace in that peace is the divine within us. Swami Satchidananda always said, who is God? He would say, peace is my God. And not a peace that's in a denial of what's happening, not a peace that's an opposite to war, but abiding in the truth of your whole own true nature, and then sharing that peace, serving from that peace in the world. What is the ultimate purpose of yoga? Finding that peace within you, your true nature, and then embodying that, emanating that, and to the best of your ability, sharing that with others. And quite frankly, with all the differences in the world, I think ultimately that's the best formula for bringing peace to the world. Finding peace within us and then expressing that in our lives. Gurudev once told a story about a man who was walking down the road, and there was a big fire burning. And he said, I have to do something. There's a fire that's burning. And he was carrying a can of gasoline. And he said, I gotta do something. I really should go and get some water, but the fire is burning. I have to do something. So he takes the can of gasoline, he throws it on the fire. What happens? Does he help the situation? It only burns brighter. So getting water is tantamount to finding the peace within you. Then you can really help to put out all the fires in the world. But I would say that doesn't mean you have to withdraw or not address problems in the world. But the advice, the message I get from that is, on a sort of human daily experience level, have your involvement commensurate with your peace. In other words, if you want to benefit the situation, don't involve yourself to the level where you become angry or bitter, aggressive or violent in the name of correcting a wrong. Let your engagement be commensurate with the peace in your heart, and through your spiritual practice, let that peace go deeper and deeper and deeper. Does that make sense to other people? Okay. I am interested in philosophy, but I believe philosophy should be practical and grounded in the reality of everyday experience. If we just leave it in the realm of the theoretical, it begins to seem unattainable and inaccessible. We have to understand the theoretical and then translate it according to our capacity into the doable. Okay? Okay, let's see if there's anything good here. Oh. Please talk about forgiving. I spent a whole year, this was many, many, many years ago, working on forgiveness. I had been practicing yoga for a long time, and it became clear to me I was still holding on to issues from my childhood, organizational issues, all sorts of things. And I realized unless I cleared that out, I was never going to be free. The thing about not forgiving is the person who remains in chains is you. Even if you have issues with respect to what someone may have done to you, that happened in the past. Who knows what's going on with that person now? But as long as you do not forgive, you're still bound by the past. You're not free. It's not easy to forgive when there's real stuff that has happened. There are different levels of forgiveness. Forgiving people who did things to us, asking forgiveness for things we may have done, or I think very often a big field of forgiveness is forgiving ourselves for our perceived weaknesses, inadequacies, or failures. Anyone ever feel that? I'll tell you an experience I once had. This happened when I was living at our ashram in Northern California. So this was in the early 70s, but something I've never forgotten. So I'm sort of new on the path. And at a certain point, whenever I'd go to sit for meditation, I recalled something that I had done a few years prior. And I would think to myself, how can I sit here and meditate when I did that? And it might not be perceived by others as a tremendous thing, but it involved not graciously receiving a guest that had come to our center, and there's a Sanskrit saying that goes, Atiti Devo Bhava, which means the guest is God. Treat the guest as God. So that memory, because I remember now, it's becoming clearer as I'm talking, the guest who had come had the mark of Shiva on his forehead too. He had holy ash on his forehead. And I was very busy, and my busyness overwhelmed my better judgment, and I didn't receive them graciously. And you know what happened? Isn't the story of Abraham that God's messengers appear in the form of guests at his home? You can tell me if I'm remembering correctly. And because he so graciously received them in his tent, Sarah was given the ability to conceive in her old age. Anyone here remember the Torah? And thus became the whole line of Judeo-Christianity from that initial gift as a result of their graciousness. So anyway, this memory was causing me great anguish. I didn't even know these people. I didn't know where they lived. There was no way to go and ask their forgiveness and apologize. So after several months of feeling tremendous anguish, I sat down and I had a conversation with God. At least I spoke, and I hope God was listening. And I said, I can't go on like this anymore. This isn't helpful. So I said, this is what I'm going to do. And I created what could be called a penance for myself. I don't know, I made it up. I didn't even know where this idea came from. So it was something that I decided I would do for a month. And it was quite difficult for me to do, but doable if I met the challenge of that difficulty. I didn't tell anyone I was doing it. I did it for a full month. I'm returning home to this was our ashram in Northern California, the last day after work. Let me tell you a little bit about that ashram. We were totally poor. Our sewage system totally broke down. And those of us who were employable were sent out into the town to try to get work, to earn some money so we could have this illusion of trying to pay this tremendous bill. Gurudev had us living on total austerity. We could only eat, this was for our spiritual benefit, 2 or 3 things at a meal, and everything counted as a thing. So I still remember the night that we came to dinner, and what they served was sour cream and prunes. I remember the lunch where they served nettles. Someone went out and pulled up nettles from the garden and steamed them, and they actually served nettles. Plus, we had to observe silence all the time because we were learning how to control our tongues. I remember the meal that got to me was called tabbouleh, but it consisted of cracked wheat and romaine lettuce. I know these days it could be a very nice dish, but to this day I cannot eat anything if they call it tabbouleh, because that was my breaking point, the tabbouleh. And to be honest, what I did, I had a little bit of money. I found the first person going to town, and I said, get me a loaf of bread and a pound of butter, and as soon as you get back, find me. Because we never had bread or butter. And I sat down, and I pretty much almost finished that loaf off in one sitting. But I digress. I'm just telling you the setting there as a background. And I lived in a remote area where no one lived, in this tiny little hut-like place where no one ever came, ever. So I'm returning from work that day. I was serving as office manager for the Clear Lake Observer, the county newspaper at the time. I came home, I walk into my little room, and on my altar, there's something about this big wrapped in gold foil in the center of my altar. I'm going, what is that? I opened it, and it was a big piece of the best chocolate ever. No one ever claimed responsibility for leaving it there. I don't know how it ever came to be there, and you can call me crazy, but I took it as a sign somehow that God received my offering. As humble and as silly as it might have seemed, but it was done with my whole heart completely. And from that moment on, I was able to release that burden I was carrying. So I think the thing to think of about forgiveness is that if we're here in human form, it means we're not perfect. If we were perfect, we'd be up in the clouds, flapping our angel wings. The fact that we're not perfect means we have lessons we need to learn. The fact that we need to learn lessons means we're going to make mistakes. And not only us, but that's true of everyone. And I think forgiveness is the pathway to salvation for us all. Forgiving ourselves and forgiving one another. Otherwise, no matter how much practice we may do that may build up our ego in so many ways, we hold one another bound in chains. Forgiveness, for me, is the path to redemption and salvation for ourselves, for our loved ones, and for all of humanity. Again, not easy, but what's the alternative? Holding on to anger, bitterness, enmity on the individual level, on the national level, and on the global level. Sometimes we say, I wish the nations of the world would come to harmony, come to peace with one another. Why do they have to continue to fight for millennia? We point our finger at the nations of the world, and then we look at our own hearts. The enmity and the unforgiveness we hold on to within. So what I would say is, we're part of the world. If this little part of the world can let go, if that part of the world in each one of us can let go, the world is so much benefited. And I think I'll finish with a quote that just came to my mind from the Reverend Martin Luther King, in which he said, we have a choice, basically. We'll either learn to live together as brothers, and I would add, and sisters, or, he said, we will perish together as fools. Those are the choices. Let's choose well. Om Shanti.